I haven't really covered when I think you should assume or suspect that memes have taken the place of critical thought in yourself or in someone else. And the best technique I have to offer is simply to watch the exact words that are used and think about them in context of the memeplexes that they're usually part of, and see if any of the associated assumptions of that memeplex are also present. That's a pretty good giveaway that it's the memeplex at least biasing the person, if not outright misleading them. So it's the surface features like the words that will get your attention most often. They're easily pattern matched. If someone uses a particular word in a context, you can usually tell something about that person's assumptions. And there's a very broad area of social, political, cultural, and religious influences with memes with particular wording coming from them. Now, I'm going to give a worked example to try and explain a time when I suspected that there is a big memetic influence on a scientist. Now, this scientist is an actual expert. There is no doubt about her credentials in my mind, nor her intelligence. It doesn't matter what her name is. I'm not out to get in a debate with her. It's just a biological anthropologist who studies love across cultures. And it's her life's work, as far as I can tell. Now, when she's answering questions from people on Twitter for one of those Wired interviews that you see online, on the topic of monogamy, she said this: "People are also adulterous, but," and then went on. In regards to cheating, she said, "I've looked at adultery in 40 cultures." Now, this term adultery is an old religious crime that influenced Western society. So when she says she's looked at adultery in 40 cultures, I get suspicious. A particular wording with all of the assumptions that go with it from, the past of Western society, and you looked at that in 40 cultures, presumably including a lot of them that don't have that same influence, I'm a bit iffy about this. When asked, "Do you believe you can have more than one soulmate?" she said, "Not at one time. True love," and true love to me is an example of memeing, not meaning. But she says true love, and she goes on to list some of the features of true love. You're not going to sleep with other people. You're not going anywhere. The implication being that if you had more than one true love, you would be going somewhere necessarily. That's the assumption of exclusivity. You might die for him or her, assuming that if a person has more than one partner, they would not die for any or all of those partners. It's very deep and genuine attachment, the assumption being that if a person has more than one true love, then that wouldn't really be a deep or genuine attachment that the person has. Now, these are all cultural assumptions with heavy stigma attached. And I'm not going to debate anyone on these. I'm just going to point out that they are cultural assumptions. And if you share those cultural assumptions, you're almost certainly biased. Or you're certainly biased and almost certainly not thinking about it and wrong. And she moved on to something even more telling. She said, best summed up by a 15th century Indian poet who said, the lane of love is narrow, there is room for only one. Aww. Except, if it's best summed up by a 15th century Indian poet, it's clearly not best summed up that way by science, is it? She's suddenly gone from science to, ancient Indian poetry to justify her point. That's very suspicious from someone who's mostly speaking in an evidence-based scientific way. It suggests that something else is influencing the person. When madly in love, it's only with one person, is another statement. Now, if you think about science, how did she scientifically determine this? How did she scientifically determine that you can't have more than one person? Now, I would assume that there are studies that you can do where you find that there's a tendency for people to, be less attached to their existing partner under certain stimuli, but you can't actually elicit attachment in a lab. So I'm very suspicious, very skeptical about this being science-based. This sounds like this person's opinion. So the principle of charity would expect you to conclude, well, look, she's skeptical. She's studied these things in all these cultures across the world, and she's found so many of examples of things working in a particular way. So she's just skeptical that it can be another way. This just seems to be how people work in regards to love and attachment. And that's fine, except that stigma and bias are real and ubiquitous. The wording reveals a strong memetic influence in this person making this judgment, and who had to step outside of her expertise to make her points towards the end. And there are many apparent counterexamples of this. People who identify as polyamorous, for example, who aren't mentioned and, for all we know, weren't studied. Maybe they were and she just forgot to mention it, but we've at least got grounds to be strongly suspicious that this is a opinion that was very broadly and very expertly thought through in many ways, but in certain areas of the subject, memes have taken the place of critical, independent thought and study. Now, this is not a challenge to the person who said these things. If there is evidence that you happen to know about and you want to write in the comments, I'd love to see it. But this is an example of how you can look at what someone's saying, analyze it, learn to pick out words that are loaded by assumptions that are cultural, social, political, religious. Look at when they change their language to step out of their area of expertise. You look at all of these surface features and the assumptions that go with them, and that's the best way you have of identifying memetic compromise to a person's rationality.